Rescued Who announces its own thematic ambivalence in its title, posing rescue as a question rather than a certainty. And that framing deserves to be taken seriously as an invitation to examine closely who actually holds power in this story and whether the language of mutual rescue obscures rather than reflects the real structure of the relationship it depicts, because a careful accounting of the facts as presented reveals an arrangement that is asymmetrical in nearly every material way, however much the narrative wants to soften that asymmetry through the emotional shorthand of recognition and shared history. Whitney's introduction as a successful, established photographer living comfortably and securely, self-sufficient enough to have chosen her isolation rather than had it forced upon her, stands in stark and important contrast to Carmen's introduction moments later, thrown literally from a moving vehicle, sobbing, digging through snow for whatever belongings she has left. And this juxtaposition is not incidental scene setting, but establishes from the outset an enormous gap in resources, stability, and leverage between the two women. A gap the story will go on to formalize rather than diminish. Because within a short span, Whitney becomes not simply a sympathetic bystander but Carmen's housing provider and her employer simultaneously, meaning that virtually every material condition of Carmen's survival, where she sleeps, what she eats, whether she has any income at all, now runs through a single person, and this concentration of dependency in one relationship deserves far more scrutiny than the story appears willing to give it before folding that same relationship into romance. It is worth being direct about why this specific configuration, benefactor and employer, collapsing into one and the same person, creates a profoundly compromised context for any subsequent intimacy to develop honestly. Because Carmen's ability to freely consent to increasing emotional or physical closeness with Whitney is inevitably shaped, whether consciously or not, by her awareness that her housing and income depend on remaining in Whitney's good graces, and this is true regardless of Whitney's intentions. Regardless of how genuinely warm or well-meaning she may be, because power imbalances do not require malicious intent to distort the dynamics of consent, they simply require one person to have significantly more control over the other's basic survival than that other person has over hers. And Carmen, homeless, friendless, and financially destitute at the story's outset, is about as far from a position of equal negotiating power as a character can be placed. The narrative's chosen justification for minimizing this imbalance, Whitney's insistence that she sees herself in Carmen, that she too was homeless 5 years prior, deserves particular scrutiny because this kind of identification-based empathy, however emotionally resonant it may feel within the story, functions here as a rhetorical move that allows the narrative to skip past the harder question of present-day power differential by redirecting attention to past similarity. And it is worth naming plainly that having once experienced hardship does not erase the power a person currently holds over someone still living inside that hardship. If anything, the specific knowledge Whitney has of what Carmen is going through, precisely because she has been there herself, gives her a particular kind of insight that could be used with great care and responsibility, or could just as easily be used, even unconsciously, to build a dependency relationship with someone whose vulnerability she understands intimately enough to navigate skillfully. And a story genuinely interested in examining this dynamic, honestly would need to sit with that uncomfortable possibility, rather than using shared history as an automatic alibi for what follows. The moment in which the professional shoot is cancelled and the two women's guards come down deserves careful reading as well, because the story frames this as an organic opportunity for closeness. Two people simply talking, learning about each other in an unstructured moment. But the fact remains that even in this apparently casual scene, one woman is Carmen's employer, and the other is her employee living in housing that employer provides, and no amount of cancelled professional obligation actually suspends that underlying structural relationship. It merely removes the formal veneer of a work task while leaving the actual power dynamic fully intact, which means whatever vulnerability Carmen shares in this moment, and whatever secret of Whitney's she comes to learn, is being exchanged within a relationship that remains fundamentally unequal regardless of how personal or unguarded the conversation feels. The story's culminating image, Carmen taking the camera from Whitney's hands and encouraging her to remove not just her clothes, but her secrets, deserve the most careful scrutiny of all, because this moment is clearly intended by the narrative to read as a beautiful inversion, the formerly powerless woman now guiding the formerly powerful one toward vulnerability, camera and control changing hands as a symbol of newly balanced intimacy. But a genuinely critical reading has to ask whether a single symbolic gesture, however well staged, actually resolves the material dependency still governing every other aspect of these two women's lives together. Because Carmen still needs this job, still lives in this home, still has nowhere else to go if this relationship sours, and the fact that she is permitted, in this one scene, to hold the camera and direct Whitney's disclosure does not change the fact that outside this scene, Whitney continues to hold all the actual leverage, And mistaking a moment of narrative symbolism for genuine structural equality is exactly the kind of storytelling sleight of hand that allows exploitative dynamics to be repackaged as romantic breakthroughs. This matters enormously for how queer women's stories get told and received, because there is a long and troubling history of media suggesting that rescue, whether financial, physical, or emotional, constitutes an appropriate foundation for romance, a shorthand in which gratitude, dependency, and desire become conflated until it becomes difficult to tell whether a character's growing feelings reflect authentic desire or simply the profound relief and attachment that come from being saved by someone who now controls the terms of that safety. And queer women deserve better than narratives that reproduce this conflation simply because the couple involved happens to be two women rather than a man and a woman. Because the underlying problem, mistaking dependency for romantic destiny, does not become less troubling when it occurs between women. It simply becomes less scrutinized, protected by the assumption that any depiction of tenderness between women must be inherently affirming regardless of the structural conditions surrounding it. A more honest and more genuinely valuable version of this story would need to let Carmen achieve real independence, her own income entirely separate from Whitney's household, her own housing, her own capacity to walk away without catastrophic consequence, before any romantic dimension between the two women could be explored with real integrity, because only once that structural dependency is dissolved can whatever affection exists between them be evaluated as something freely chosen rather than something shaped, even subtly, by the practical reality of who controls whose survival, and a narrative patient enough to wait for that independence before allowing romance to develop would tell a considerably more meaningful story about mutual respect and equal footing than one that rushes toward intimacy, while Carmen remains entirely dependent on Whitney for every material necessity of her life. It is also worth naming that this pattern, wealthy or established women extending both material rescue and romantic interest toward homeless or destitute women in quick succession, reflects a broader and troubling cultural fantasy, one in which economic vulnerability becomes recast as a romantic meet-cute opportunity, obscuring the reality that genuine, healthy intimacy depends on both parties having sufficient independent footing to freely choose the relationship rather than needing it to survive. And stories that blur this line risk normalizing exactly the kind of power imbalance dynamic that queer women, like all women, deserve to recognize and resist in their own lives, whether the imbalance takes the shape of financial dependency, professional subordination, or any other structure in which one person's basic security rests in another person's hands. What ultimately makes who rescued who worth this level of scrutiny rather than casual dismissal is precisely that its underlying emotional instincts, empathy born of shared hardship, tenderness offered to someone in crisis, are not inherently wrong or exploitative in themselves. The impulse to help someone who reminds you of your own difficult past is a recognizable and often genuinely admirable human response. But the story's failure lies in its unwillingness to separate that admirable impulse toward care from the entirely separate question of whether romance can be responsibly pursued, while such a stark power imbalance remains completely unaddressed. And until a narrative like this one is willing to let its rescued character achieve real, independent footing before any romantic dimension enters the story, audiences, and particularly queer women looking for representations of authentic and equal intimacy, deserve to read stories like this one with real skepticism about whose interests the framing of rescue is actually designed to serve.